Good morning. This is Solomon Jones on 900 AM, 96.1 FM, WURD. And I'd like to welcome Stacey Abrams to the show. Good morning. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Yep, it's a pleasure. So the thing I want to ask you first is about, because I want to talk about voter suppression, but I think in order to do that, we have to talk about your experience because you ran for governor in Georgia. Many people thought you were going to win. We saw what the polling said, but there were some things that happened in Georgia during that run that really smacked of voter suppression. What happened when you ran for governor?
Well, we know that the Secretary of State, my opponent in the race, had spent 8 years in the role of oversight of the election. And during his tenure, he purged more than 1.4 million voters. He oversaw the closure of 214 precincts, which according to independent analysis meant that between 50 and 85,000 people physically could not reach a place to vote. We know that under his leadership, we saw 53,000 people who had their voter registrations held hostage using a discredited system called exact match that the Obama administration had warned was racially discriminatory. And in his case, when he used it, 80% of the people who were held hostage were people of color, 70% were Black, and he ran the election. And I would just challenge anyone to think of a single event where the person in charge of counting the votes, in charge of the score, also got to be the referee and the contestant.
Yeah. And so that happened in your race, and it was something that when I looked at it, I hadn't thought that anything like that would be possible. What role did the scuttling of the Voting Rights Act play in allowing that to happen in your race?
So there are two pieces to this. We have to recognize that voter suppression has been long a part of our national story. It's not endemic to the South, although the South has perfected it, unfortunately. And Georgia in 2018 was a perfect example of all of the challenges that had been held at bay by the Voting Rights Act being overwhelmed. The closure of 214 polling places out of the 1,688 that were closed around the South. The ability to purge 1.4 million voters, including people whose only offense was not that they left, not that they weren't eligible, they simply had chosen not to vote. And unfortunately, in the United States, in 9 states, it is the law of the land that you can have your right to vote removed simply for not using it. Although there are 44 states that use this process. And so we know overall that in Georgia, had the Voting Rights Act been in place, many of the harms that we saw befall Georgia voters would have been, if not prevented, at least would have been mitigated, and there would have been awareness. But what I want people to understand is that what happened to me in Georgia happens around the country. Georgia was just a perfect example of all of the worst actions happening at once. But my mission has been to make certain that we don't think that voter suppression only happens in the South or only happens in Georgia. We need to understand that it happens around this country every day, and that we have the ability, when we know what it looks like, we have the ability to fight back.
So what does voter suppression look like? I mean, we saw polling places closed. We saw people purged from the voting rolls, but there are other ways that people go about voter suppression. How does voter suppression happen other than those a couple of ways?
So we have to think about it as an architecture. There are 3 things that happen no matter where you live. You can put voter suppression in one of these 3 buckets. 1, can you register and stay on the rolls? And so we've got states like Texas that until just recently would not permit anyone to register to vote online, despite a pandemic and despite the fact that many of the offices where you could go to vote were actually shut down. So it's, can you register, but it's also, can you stay on the rolls? States like Georgia, Florida, Ohio, Wisconsin, where voter purging happens, unfortunately, with high rates. Then can you register and stay on the rolls? The second is, can you cast your ballot? We have watched Pennsylvania actually take some really important steps to allow people to cast their ballots by adding vote by mail, early voting, expanding access. That's an important metric, because in states where you cannot cast your ballot because they've shut down your polling places, because they have strict voter ID laws, where communities of color and poor people can't meet the newly more restrictive measures. That's a way to stop people from voting. And telling people you have to have an excuse in the midst of COVID in order to vote by mail. That's what we saw happen in Wisconsin. That's what we saw happen in Georgia. Or sorry, not Georgia. It's what we saw happen in Wisconsin and other states. And Alabama is a state where they're trying to not allow you to vote by mail unless you're over 65 or have a disability. They've had really strict statutes. So it's, can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast your ballot? And the third is, does your ballot get counted? We know, unfortunately, that in the primaries where we saw a heightened use of voters using the mail-in ballot option, more than 500,000 ballots were thrown out. That means those votes weren't counted, even though the people trying to vote likely had done everything they thought they needed to do. And so we're working on making sure that if you vote by mail, that you follow the rules, that you have a place to drop off your ballots. And we're very proud of the fact that Pennsylvania is expanding the places for drop boxes, expanding how you can return your mail. We know that if you can register and stay on the rolls, if you can cast your ballot, and if your ballot gets counted, then you have beaten voter suppression. But if there are any impediments to all three of those, that's when you're facing voter suppression, and that's when you need to report it.
Well, one of the things that's happening here in Pennsylvania is that you have Republicans in our state legislature trying to push legislation to stop that expansion that you're talking about. Stop you from having places where you can drop off your ballots, allow people from across the state to come to different counties and become poll watchers. Those are the kinds of things that are happening on a state level. And I imagine from your experience that you understand this is where these things happen. They happen on a state level. It's not always federal, even local.
Well, and that's the challenge. We know that the Constitution has granted the right to vote. We know that the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. The 19th Amendment gave white women the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act expanded that to cover all communities. The 26th Amendment gave young people under the age of 21, between 18 and 21, the right to vote. But the reality is the right to administer elections by Constitution is given to the states. And we know, unfortunately, in the 21st century, the purveyors of voter suppression are largely Republicans. Now, let's be clear. Democrats had a really good run during Jim Crow. So I'm not saying it's one party versus the other, but you have to look at the party practicing the evil where you stand. And right now it's the Republican Party, because they know that they can lose power if people can actually cast their ballots and make their choices. But in a democracy, that's our right. I wrote a book called Our Time Is Now that came out in June, and we've got a film coming out on Amazon on September 18th, and both really help Americans understand the history of voter suppression and the current reality of voter suppression. It's a hard enemy to fight when you don't know what it looks like. And so, your question about what does it look like to have voter suppression in Pennsylvania, it's having Republican legislators trying to block you from being able to cast your ballots and safely drop them off in a drop box when we know that's a safe, accessible way to cast your ballot and to participate in our democracy.
So one of the things that happened, ironically, is that Democrats filed suit here in Pennsylvania in order to get the Green Party off the ballot, right? And so one of the things that they're saying is delaying the actual ballot from being produced is that lawsuit and many others. I mean, this is a swing state. Donald Trump won it by about 1 percentage point, a little bit less in 2016. So how do you deal with these things at the state level? I know you have an organization called Fair Fight that deals with voter suppression. How do you deal with these things on a state level?
So what we've done through Fair Fight, and I want to talk about it sort of before and after. Before there was a nominee for the Democratic Party for president, we were involved in building voter protection teams across 18 battleground states, including Pennsylvania. And those voter protection teams did great work in making sure that voters in the state of Pennsylvania had access to the best information during your primary. Where we are now is that Fair Fight is working on election administration, making sure that the mechanisms work, that we have the volunteers we need, that we have the information that we need. The Biden campaign is doing its work to make certain that anyone who wants to vote can vote if you are legally eligible. And I encourage everyone to go to iwillvote.com/PA to find out what the rules are in Pennsylvania. Because the bottom line is this. This is a pivotal election that will determine the future of our country. And I know we say that every time, but we've never been in the midst of a public health catastrophe, an economic crisis, and a racial reckoning all in the same moment in a presidential year where one of the candidates, the sitting president of the United States, has abdicated responsibility on every single one of those issues. And so Joe Biden is the only candidate who's talking about how we meet this moment and how we move forward, how we build back better. I want everyone who listens to your show to know that Joe Biden can't do this alone, and there is no savior. We're not going to elect a savior. But what we can do is be able to participate in our elections and elect people who are willing to be workers, who are willing to do the work, including on the state legislative level. Because a lot of the challenges that you face in Pennsylvania come from a Republican legislature that is doing its best to constrict who has the right to vote, meaning who has the right to be heard. And we should not just pay attention to the presidency. You need to pay attention to who's running for the state legislature, who's running for your congressional seats, who's running for your city council, your county commissions, all of those issues. Leadership is strongest when it's closest to home. So we can't keep so much of our attention focused on the presidency, but in this year in particular, we got to do all of the above. We can't stop at the top, but we got to start at the top. We got to get all the way down to the fine print.
Yeah. We're talking with Stacey Abrams about voter suppression and the 2020 election. So let's talk about that election and the candidate you're supporting, Joe Biden, because a lot of folks in the community still not really sure about Joe Biden. We know that he was vice president for 8 years under Barack Obama. We know that he has a long history in the Senate. Some things we like, some things we don't. As far as the Black community is concerned, just leaving Trump out of it, why should the Black community support Joe Biden?
Because we have been disproportionately affected by every ill and every challenge of this current age. We have faced disproportionate effects from COVID-19 as a healthcare crisis. And Joe Biden is the only candidate who has, one, actually done something to expand access to healthcare, working with President Obama to create the Affordable Care Act, to create Medicaid expansion, to expand access to healthcare, and he intends to do even more as the next president. Well, and I hear your question, but we can't help but contrast it with our current president, who has said he wants to eliminate the Affordable Care Act. He wants to erase the legacy of Barack Obama. He wants to eviscerate access to health care. Number two, we are facing an economic crisis that is disproportionately affecting Black people. Our economics have gotten even worse under COVID-19, and the resources, whether it's the PPP program or the deployment of additional unemployment aid, has been made harder by this administration. Joe Biden has a plan to do it right, and we know he can because he was in charge the last time we went through an economic crisis. He was side by side, shoulder to shoulder with Barack Obama to deliver economic recovery, and the current president has said that he doesn't even want to do a COVID relief package to help the people who need it the most. And then third, we are facing a racial reckoning, racial injustice that is being, I think, most clearly objectified through what's happening with the police, but we know it goes deeper than that and broader than that. But only one candidate, Joe Biden, has said that we have to deal with bad actors, with cops who do not do their job, who hurt people, and there have to be consequences. But he also has a plan for how we build stronger communities. He's the only candidate who not only has a plan, but has a history of doing it. We can absolutely disagree with past actions, but what I look to when I look at people running for office is, have you made mistakes? Have you done things that maybe with more information you would do differently? Are you willing to be better? The current president has never once said that he's made a mistake. He does not acknowledge that he can do things better. And Joe Biden has said he wants to build back better, and he wants to build back better in our communities. And that's the kind of leadership we need.
All right, that's Stacey Abrams talking about Joe Biden. My last question is this, and I'm going to kind of reiterate my last question and maybe rephrase it. Because a lot of the complaints I hear, I talk to our community every day. And one of the things that I hear from folks is that, yes, we understand why we should vote against Donald Trump as a Black community. But a lot of people are wondering why they should vote for Joe Biden. And that's why I said leaving Trump out of it, why Joe Biden?
And that's what I was saying. I think it's important to be really honest. Voting for anyone doesn't solve every problem. Didn't work, it's never worked. We don't elect saviors. We elect workers. And when you elect someone to work for you, you want to look at their work history, and you want to look at what they say they intend to do if they get the job. I'm voting for Joe Biden because I've seen his work history, but I also have seen what he plans to do if he gets the job. But the other reality is, this isn't just about hiring, this is about firing. And we got to remember, you can't hire somebody new unless you fire the person you got. And that's why it's, I think, impossible to separate the two. It's not about a contrast between Trump and Biden. It's about knowing what we've got that doesn't work and knowing what we can have that does work, and looking at the history, a 40-year history of standing up for communities, of standing in the gap with us. But more than anything, it's about us. Because I don't elect saviors. I don't vote for people because they're going to save my life. I vote for people because they're going to believe in my community. And Joe Biden has never taken the Black community for granted, and he won't when he becomes the next president of the United States.
So when we go to vote this election, there are a number of states where there are some voter suppression tactics being used. The states where they're actually trying to do mail-in voting, Nevada comes to mind, the president attacking the governor of Nevada on mail-in voting, that kind of thing. How do we protect our vote in this upcoming election?
First of all, don't panic. We know the best part about talking about voter suppression is that we know what the enemy looks like now. For so many years, especially in 2016, we whispered about it, but everyone thought it was their fault. I should have known. No, voter suppression is an active attempt to stop, in particular, Black people from voting. And now that we know the enemy is real, we can fight back. So one, don't panic. Number two, make a plan, and make a plan to vote early. In Pennsylvania and actually 41 states, you can vote by mail with no excuses. So go to iwillvote.com to get the plan for your state. Find out what your rules are and make a plan to vote early by mail. Make a backup plan to vote in person early in case the vote by mail doesn't work, and make a backup to your backup to vote on election day on November 3rd. Because we know that it's 2020, so there might be a volcano hidden somewhere under Pennsylvania we didn't know about. So we need to plan to vote early by mail, have a backup plan to vote early in person, and have a backup to that backup to vote in person on election day. And then make sure everyone people you know, people you like, people you don't like, people you owe money to, make sure everyone has a plan to vote and that they write it down. Because when they catch us flat-footed, when they catch us with urgencies or with thousands of people flowing into the state to try to scare you out of voting, if we've gotten our votes banked, if we've gotten our stuff taken care of, if we've already got a plan for what they're going to do, then we have the plan to win. And that's my mission.
All right. That is Stacey Abrams, former Georgia gubernatorial candidate, founder of Fair Fight, also an author as well. Your book, of course, available now. We want to make sure people get that. And I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning on WURD.
Thank you so much, Solomon. I appreciate you having me.